The call came in just after sunrise, at a time when the city was only beginning to wake up. Morning traffic hummed faintly in the distance, and the sky carried a pale gray light that promised another ordinary day. For the residents of the apartment building on Grant Street, however, that morning would be anything but ordinary. A man named Daniel Cross had been found unresponsive in his apartment, and the neighbor who discovered him knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. Daniel lived on the 8th floor, in a building known for its quiet hallways and predictable routines. Most of the residents were professionals who left early and returned late. Neighbors passed each other with polite nods but rarely stopped to talk. Daniel fit perfectly into that environment. He was reserved, almost invisible. People recognized his face but knew little else about him. The neighbor who called the police was Mrs. Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher who lived across the hall. She had noticed Daniel's door slightly open when she went out to collect her newspaper. That alone was unusual. Daniel was careful, almost obsessive, about locking his door. She knocked lightly, expecting him to appear, embarrassed that he had forgotten. When there was no answer, she pushed the door open a little more and called his name. The silence that followed made her uneasy. Inside, the apartment felt strangely still. The air was cool, and the curtains were half drawn, letting in thin lines of morning light. Mrs. Alvarez did not go far. From the doorway, she could see Daniel lying on his bed. He wasn't moving. She called his name again, louder this time. When he did not respond, fear took over. She backed out, trembling, and dialed emergency services. When police arrived, they moved quickly but carefully. 2 officers stepped inside, scanning the room for signs of danger. Their training told them to expect chaos in cases of violent death. Broken furniture, bloodstains, signs of struggle. But the apartment offered none of that. Daniel lay flat on his back on the neatly made bed. His shoes were still on, lined up straight, as if he had just sat down and never stood up again. His hands rested calmly on his chest. His face was pale but peaceful. There were no visible injuries, no bruises, no cuts, no blood. The room itself looked untouched. Books were stacked neatly on a shelf. A laptop sat closed on the desk. The kitchen counter was clean, with no dainty dishes. On the nightstand beside the bed was a glass of water, half full, and a digital alarm clock that read 6:12 a.m. The ticking sound filled the room, loud in the silence. One officer frowned. Death scenes were rarely this orderly. Even natural deaths often left some sign of distress. But Daniel's apartment felt more like a paused moment than a crime scene. Paramedics confirmed what everyone already suspected. Daniel Cross was dead. At first, the assumption was that he had died in his sleep. The absence of blood or trauma pointed in that direction. Still, protocol required caution. The officers secured the apartment and began documenting everything. Photos were taken from every angle. Measurements were noted. The glass of water was left untouched. As they worked, small details began to stand out. Daniel's wallet lay on the dresser, open, with cash and cards inside. Nothing appeared to be missing. His keys were on the kitchen counter, but his phone was nowhere to be found. In modern life, a missing phone is rarely accidental. People carried them everywhere, even to bed. Officers checked under the pillow, between the sheets, under the bed. Nothing. They searched the couch, the bathroom, the kitchen. Still nothing. The absence of the phone raised quiet alarm bells. Detectives arrived shortly after. They listened carefully as the officers explained what they had found. One detective, seasoned and observant, walked slowly through the apartment, letting his eyes take everything in. He paused near the bed and stared at Daniel's face longer than necessary. Something about the scene felt staged, almost too calm. The detective asked neighbors a few basic questions while the body was prepared for transport. Mrs. Alvarez was shaken but cooperative. She said Daniel had been polite, always greeting her with a small smile. She could not recall any visitors, arguments, or strange behavior. Another neighbor said he had heard nothing unusual during the night. No raised voices. No sounds of distress. Security footage from the building lobby was reviewed. Cameras showed Daniel entering the building alone the previous evening, just after 9 p.m. He looked normal, calm. He even paused to check his mailbox. No one followed him. No one visited afterward. By all appearances, Daniel had gone upstairs, entered his apartment, and never come out again. As the body was taken away, the detective stood in the doorway and looked back one last time. The glass of water caught his attention again. It sat there quietly, reflecting the light from the window. Something about it felt important, though he could not yet explain why. Later that day, the medical examiner began the preliminary examination. There were still no visible signs of violence. Daniel's body showed no defensive wounds. His nails were clean. His clothes were unwrinkled. It was as if death had arrived without warning or resistance. But appearances can be deceiving. Back at the station, the case was logged as a suspicious death. Not a homicide yet, but not natural either. Daniel's age alone made a simple explanation unlikely. 39-year-old men did not usually die quietly in their sleep without a cause. As detectives began the early paperwork, they pulled up Daniel's basic records. He worked as a data analyst for a private company. No criminal history. No restraining orders. No known enemies. He lived alone and kept his life private. The more they learned, the more unsettling the case became. Daniel seemed almost too ordinary. Too careful. Too invisible. That night, the apartment sat dark and empty, sealed with police tape. The hallway outside was quiet, just as it always was. Neighbors walked past the door, glancing at it briefly before moving on. Life continued, unaware that a mystery had just begun. A man was dead. There was no blood, no weapon, no sign of struggle. And yet, somewhere within that silent apartment, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The autopsy began early the next morning in a cold, sterile room far removed from the quiet apartment where Daniel Cross had died. Bright lights reflected off steel surfaces as the medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Porter, reviewed the initial report. On paper, Daniel's death still looked deceptively simple. No visible injuries. No signs of trauma. No evidence of a violent struggle. But Dr. Porter had seen enough cases to know that the absence of blood did not mean the absence of violence. Daniel's body lay still on the examination table, his features unchanged from the moment he had been found. Peaceful. Almost relaxed. Dr. Porter noted the lack of tension in his muscles, the calm expression frozen on his face. Death, in this case, had not come with fear or pain. That alone made her uneasy. As she began her work, she examined every inch of his body with careful precision. She checked for needle marks, bruising beneath the skin, signs of suffocation, and subtle injuries that might escape an untrained eye. There were none. His throat was clay. His lungs showed no signs of drowning or inhalation of foreign substances. His heart appeared normal for a man his age. Hours passed as samples were collected and tests were ordered. Blood, tissue, and stomach contents were all sent to the lab. Toxicology screens were requested, not as a formality, but as a necessity. Something about Daniel's death felt wrong, and Dr. Porter trusted that instinct. When the preliminary results arrived later that evening, they confirmed her suspicions. Daniel had not died naturally. A foreign substance had been detected in his bloodstream. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was there. Further analysis revealed it to be a rare toxin, one not commonly seen outside of controlled environments. The substance worked slowly and quietly, interfering with the body's ability to regulate vital functions. It weakened the muscles, slowed the heart, and eventually caused respiratory failure. Daniel had been poisoned. The news reached the detectives late that night. What had started as a suspicious death was now officially a homicide. The lack of blood, the calm scene, the neat apartment all made sense now. Poisoning was the killer's way of remaining invisible. Detectives returned to the apartment with new eyes. Every object was suddenly a potential weapon. Every surface could hold answers. The glass of water on the nightstand became the primary focus. Lab tests confirmed the presence of the same toxin found in Daniel's body. He had ingested it shortly before his death. The timing suggested he had been alive and conscious when he drank the water. He had likely felt nothing at first. No burning. No strange taste. Just water. Within hours, his body would have begun to shut down. The realization chilled the investigators. Daniel had gone to bed thinking he was safe. But questions multiplied just as quickly as answers appeared. Who had poisoned the water? When had it been done? And how had the killer managed it without leaving a trace? There were no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. Windows were sealed. The building's security system showed no unauthorized access. Whoever did this either had access to Daniel's apartment or found a way to act without ever stepping inside. The missing phone suddenly felt more important than ever. Detectives believed it might hold messages, calls, or online activity that could explain who wanted Daniel dead. Without it, they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Investigators began rebuilding Daniel's final day minute by minute. His co-workers said he had seemed normal at the office. Quiet, focused, and slightly tired, but nothing unusual. He had left work on time and declined an invitation to join colleagues for dinner, saying he had things to do at home. Security footage showed him stopping at a convenience store on the way back to his apartment. He bought bottled water, among other items. That detail immediately caught the detective's attention. The bottle found in his trash matched the brand on the receipt, but the glass of water by his bed was not from that bottle. It was tap water. That meant Daniel had poured the water himself, at home. Someone had poisoned it before or during that process. Detectives questioned everyone who might have had access to Daniel's apartment. Maintenance workers were interviewed. The building manager was questioned. Cleaning staff logs were reviewed. No one reported entering Daniel's unit recently. Keys were tightly controlled, and no duplicates were missing. Friends and family were also questioned. Daniel's sister described him as private and cautious. He rarely invited people over. He disliked surprises. If someone had been inside his apartment, he would have known. That left one unsettling possibility. Daniel had poisoned himself. But that theory quickly fell apart. There was no suicide note. No history of depression. No evidence he had purchased or researched the toxin found in his body. And the missing phone made suicide seem even less likely. People planning to take their own lives did not usually erase themselves so completely. As detectives reviewed Daniel's computer, they discovered something unexpected. His browsing history showed recent searches related to chemical compounds and toxins. At first glance, it looked suspicious. But Daniel's job involved data analysis across many subjects. Researching unusual topics was not uncommon for him. Still, one detail stood out. The searches were not general. They were specific. Daniel had been reading about rare poisons that caused death without obvious signs. The room fell silent as detectives absorbed that information. Why would he look up such things days before his own murder? The possibility emerged that Daniel knew he was in danger. Or worse, that he had unknowingly crossed paths with someone dangerous. As more digital data was recovered, a hidden side of Daniel began to surface. His online activity went far beyond work-related research. He spent long hours on forums, using anonymous usernames, engaging in heated discussions with strangers. These forums were not casual spaces. They were intense, secretive communities where accusations were thrown freely and grudges were built over time. Daniel was not a passive observer. He argued. He challenged people. He exposed information. Detectives began to see a pattern. Daniel may have made enemies without ever meeting them face to face. The toxin itself offered another clue. It was not easy to obtain. It required knowledge, patience, and access to specialized sources. This was not a crime of impulse. It was planned, carefully. The absence of blood, the peaceful scene, and the slow-acting poison all pointed to one conclusion. The killer wanted Daniel to die quietly, without drawing attention. No noise. No struggle. No witnesses. As the night wore on, the detectives realized they were dealing with a different kind of murderer. Someone intelligent. Someone patient. Someone who understood how to kill without ever touching the victim. Daniel Cross had been murdered in silence, and the key to understanding why lay buried deep within a life that, until now, no one had truly known. The autopsy had answered one question but opened many more. And somewhere out there, the person responsible believed they had committed the perfect crime. As the investigation moved forward, the focus slowly shifted away from Daniel Cross's quiet apartment and toward the invisible world he spent most of his time in. The physical evidence had reached its limits. The poison, the water glass, The locked door all pointed to a carefully planned crime, but they did not reveal the killer. To find answers, detectives had to understand Daniel himself, not the version his neighbors saw, but the one hidden behind screens and usernames. At first, Daniel's online presence seemed ordinary. His work email was professional and uneventful. His social media accounts were inactive, showing only old photos and occasional comments from years ago. It appeared as if Daniel preferred privacy, choosing to live without leaving digital footprints behind. But that impression changed the moment detectives accessed his encrypted files and recovered browsing data from his computer. What they found was a second life. Daniel spent hours each night on online forums that were closed to the general public. These were places where anonymity was valued and real names were never used. People discussed sensitive topics, shared theories, and sometimes accused others of serious wrongdoing. The tone was often hostile. Arguments escalated quickly. Trust was rare. Under a username that no one had ever connected to Daniel Cross, he was active, vocal, and relentless. He wrote long posts, carefully structured and filled with details. He challenged others aggressively, demanding evidence, exposing inconsistencies, and refusing to back down when confronted. This was not the quiet man neighbors described. This was someone driven by belief, someone who felt compelled to uncover truth, even at a cost. Detectives read through months of Daniel's posts, slowly piecing together his mindset. He believed that many people escaped justice simply because there was not enough proof to bring them to court. Online, he acted as judge and investigator, collecting fragments of information and presenting them publicly. He believed exposure itself was a form of justice. That belief had made him enemies. One thread, in particular, stood out. It involved a heated argument between Daniel and another anonymous user. The conversation had begun calmly, with a discussion about an old unsolved crime. But as Daniel posted more details, his tone sharpened. He accused the other user of being directly involved in the crime. He claimed to have connected timelines, locations, and online activity patterns. He did not just suggest guilt. He stated it as fact. The accused user denied everything. Other forum members stepped in, some supporting Daniel, others warning him to be careful. But Daniel refused to stop. He posted again and again, releasing more information, hinting that he could reveal the person's real identity if necessary. Then, without warning, the other user disappeared from the forum. No goodbye message. No defense. Just silence. Detectives traced the account as far as they could. It led them through layers of online anonymity, but eventually, a real name surfaced. Marcus Hale. A man in his early 40s with a troubling past. He had been questioned years earlier in connection with a violent incident but was never charged. Lack of evidence had set him free. When detectives pulled Marcus's file, the connection became impossible to ignore. Daniel's accusations online matched details from that old case. Information that was never made public appeared in Daniel's posts, suggesting he had access to restricted data or had spent years researching the incident. The possibility that Daniel had exposed Marcus online sent a wave of tension through the investigation. Public accusations, even anonymous ones, could destroy lives. They could also provoke dangerous reactions. Detectives brought Marcus in for questioning. He arrived calm but guarded. He claimed he had never heard of Daniel Cross. He admitted to using online forums in the past, but said he had stopped years ago. When shown screenshots of the argument, his expression tightened for just a moment before returning to neutral. Marcus denied any involvement in Daniel's death. He said online arguments meant nothing. People accused each other all the time. He insisted he had no reason to harm someone he had never met. But small details betrayed him. When asked about the specific toxin used in the murder, Marcus paused. He said he had no knowledge of poisons, yet a background check revealed he had studied chemistry briefly in college. It was not enough to prove anything, but it raised suspicion. His alibi was weak. He claimed he had been at home the night Daniel died, watching television alone. No witnesses. No proof. Phone records placed him in the same general area of the city, not far from Daniel's apartment building. Still, there was a major obstacle. There was no evidence Marcus had ever entered the building. Security cameras did not show him. No key logs connected him to the apartment. Without that link, The case against him remained circumstantial. As detectives continued digging into Daniel's online activity, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Daniel had not only accused Marcus, he had contacted him privately. Recovered message logs showed Daniel sending direct messages, warning Marcus that he was close to revealing everything. He claimed to have proof. He threatened to make the information public if Marcus did not confess. Those messages had been sent just days before Daniel's death. The tone of the messages was confident, almost reckless. Daniel seemed convinced he was untouchable. He believed that operating behind anonymity kept him safe. He underestimated how dangerous the situation had become. The missing phone suddenly made sense. If the killer had access to Daniel's online accounts, erasing direct messages would delay the investigation and protect their identity. Cybercrime specialists were brought in. They discovered unauthorized access attempts on Daniel's account shortly after his death. Someone had logged in remotely and deleted data. Someone who knew exactly where to look. The online world that Daniel thought protected him had become the place where his life was quietly dismantled. As detectives reviewed the final posts Daniel made before his death, they noticed a shift in his writing. The confidence was still there, but there was also urgency. He wrote as if time was running out. One post ended with a sentence that now felt haunting. Truth always finds its way out. That post was made less than 24 hours before Daniel died. The investigation now had a direction, but the danger was far from over. Whoever had silenced Daniel had done so without leaving blood, noise, or witnesses. They had used knowledge and distance as weapons. They had turned the digital world into a killing ground. For the detectives, the realization was chilling. The murder was not just about poison. It was about control, revenge, and the belief that justice could be taken into one's own hands. Daniel Cross had believed the internet gave him power. In the end, it was the very thing that exposed him to a killer who was watching, waiting, and willing to act without ever being seen. By the time the investigation reached its fourth phase, detectives were trapped inside a contradiction that refused to resolve itself. Every piece of evidence pointed toward Marcus Hale, yet the physical reality of the crime scene refused to cooperate. There was no footage of him entering Daniel Cross's building. No witness had seen him near the 8th floor. No fingerprints, no fibers, no trace of his presence inside the apartment. If Marcus was the killer, then he had committed murder without ever setting foot in the victim's home. That idea seemed impossible at first. Murder required proximity, or at least contact. But as detectives revisited the case from the beginning, they realized they were still thinking in traditional terms. This crime had never followed traditional rules. The breakthrough came late one evening, not from a dramatic discovery, but from paperwork. A junior detective had been asked to review building security logs again, line by line, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. Hours passed with nothing but routine entries until one detail stood out. A delivery had been made to Daniel's apartment on the afternoon before his death. The log was brief. A courier had dropped off a small package at the front desk. It was listed as a personal delivery, not food or groceries. The sender's name was missing, which was unusual but not unheard of. The package had been taken upstairs by the courier and left at Daniel's door. At the time, no one had questioned it. People received packages every day. But now, the timing was impossible to ignore. Detectives returned to Daniel's apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. During the initial search, they had found an empty cardboard box near the trash, flattened and tossed aside. It had seemed harmless, forgettable. Now it became the center of attention. The box was small, clean, and carefully opened, not torn or damaged. Inside the trash, they found protective padding and a thin layer of foam, shaped to hold a single object. There were no labels left behind, no invoices, no notes. Whatever had been inside was gone. Daniel's computer provided the next piece of the puzzle. His recent searches included terms related to raw materials and chemical samples. He had also browsed academic articles about contamination risks and handling procedures. These searches had puzzled detectives earlier. Now, they made sense. Daniel believed he had received a research-related item. The theory began to form slowly but clearly. Someone had sent Daniel a package designed to appear harmless, even interesting. something that would appeal to his curiosity and intellectual nature. He would open it without hesitation, unaware that the act itself would expose him to danger. Forensic specialists examined the box more closely. Using advanced techniques, they detected faint chemical residue on the interior foam. It matched the toxin found in Daniel's body. The amount was tiny, barely measurable, but enough to confirm that the poison had been inside the package. The murder weapon was not a knife, a gun, or even the glass of water. It was the package itself. Detectives reconstructed the sequence of events. Daniel returned home that evening and found the box waiting for him. Curious, he opened it, possibly at his desk or kitchen counter. Inside was a small bottle, likely labeled as a rare mineral sample or chemical compound. The container had been engineered to leak microscopic amounts of toxin when handled. It did not spill. It did not break. It simply transferred poison onto the skin. Daniel, unaware, would have washed his hands later or perhaps not at all. Even after washing, traces could remain. When he later poured himself a glass of water before bed, the toxin transferred from his hands to the glass, and then into the water. The poison was tasteless, invisible, and deadly. This explained everything. There was no forced entry because the killer never entered. No struggle because Daniel never knew he was being attacked. No blood because the toxin did its work silently. Now detectives turned their attention back to Marcus Hale with new intensity. Could he have arranged the delivery? Could he have designed such a method? Financial records provided the answer. Marcus had purchased specialized lab equipment months earlier. Not enough to attract attention on its own, but combined with his background in chemistry, it painted a disturbing picture. He had also made small payments to a private shipping service, one that allowed anonymous senders under certain conditions. When confronted with the delivery evidence, Marcus's confidence began to crack. He admitted to sending a package to Daniel but claimed it was harmless. He said it was meant to intimidate, not kill. He wanted Daniel to stop making accusations. He wanted to scare him into silence. But the science told a different story. Experts testified that the toxin used could not accidentally cause death in the way it did. The dosage, the delivery method, and the timing were all precise. This was not a warning. It was an execution. Marcus's defense argued that Daniel's own actions had caused the poisoning. They suggested Daniel mishandled the substance or exposed himself intentionally. But there was no evidence Daniel knew the package was dangerous. There were no warning labels, no instructions, no indication he suspected a threat. The absence of Daniel's phone became the final piece of the puzzle. Cyber investigators discovered that Marcus had accessed Daniel's online accounts after the estimated time of death. He had used previously exchanged messages to bypass security systems. He deleted conversations, wiped data, and remotely reset the phone before discarding it. This delayed the discovery of their online conflict and bought Marcus time. Detectives now understood the full scope of the crime. It was not just a murder. It was a calculated effort to erase a person, both physically and digitally. Marcus had not wanted Daniel to die loudly. He wanted him to dissipate quietly, leaving behind confusion instead of answers. As the case moved closer to trial, the concept of a murder without a visit fascinated and unsettled the public. News outlets struggled to explain how someone could kill without ever being present. Experts spoke about the dangers of anonymity, of how knowledge and distance could be weaponized. For the detectives, the realization was personal. They had walked through Daniel's apartment, stood beside his bed, and searched for signs that were never going to be there. The crime had happened days earlier, when a simple delivery had crossed the threshold of his life. Marcus Hale was arrested and charged, but even in custody, he insisted he never intended to kill. He claimed Daniel had pushed him, humiliated him, and forced his hand. He painted himself as the victim of online harassment. But the evidence was unrelenting. The package, the toxin, the digital trail, the timing. Daniel Cross had trusted his curiosity, his intellect, and his belief in truth. Those qualities had been turned against him. The murder without a visit had proven that violence did not always require presence. Sometimes, it arrived disguised as a gift, left quietly at the door, and waited patiently to do its work. The case was nearly complete, but its final chapter would decide whether justice could speak as loudly as silence had. The courtroom was filled long before the trial officially began. Reporters crowded the benches, notebooks ready, cameras waiting for moments that could be turned into headlines. True crime podcasts and documentaries had already begun discussing the case, fascinated by the idea of a murder with no blood and no physical confrontation. For many, it sounded almost unreal. For Daniel Cross's family, it was a painful reality that refused to fade. Marcus Hale sat at the defense table, expression controlled, hands folded neatly in front of him. He did not look like a killer. He looked like an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary situation. That, his lawyers believed, was their strongest advantage. There were no dramatic images of violence for the jury to react to. No photographs of wounds. No screaming witnesses. Just science, timelines, and quiet intent. The prosecution opened with a simple statement. Daniel Cross was alive, healthy, and alone in his apartment. Within hours, he was dead. The cause was poison. The method was deliberate. And the person responsible had planned the crime so carefully that he believed he would never be seen. They told the jury that this was not a crime of passion. It was not an accident. It was a calculated response to being exposed and threatened in a public digital space. Marcus Hale, they said, had chosen silence as his weapon. As witnesses took the stand, the story unfolded piece by piece. The medical examiner explained how the toxin worked, describing how it left no marks and caused the body to shut down slowly. She spoke calmly, but the effect on the courtroom was heavy. Jurors listened closely as she explained that the poison did not cause pain, but that it required precise knowledge to use effectively. Forensic experts followed, describing the residue found inside the delivery box. They explained how modern toxins could be transferred through skin contact, and how even careful washing might not remove all traces. The glass of water from Daniel's nightstand was presented as evidence, sealed and preserved. The jury saw how something so ordinary could become fatal. Then came the digital evidence. Cybercrime specialists testified about the online forums Daniel had used and the messages he had exchanged with Marcus. Screenshots of the arguments were shown, carefully edited to remove usernames, but the hostility was clear. Daniel's accusations, Marcus's denials, and the rising tension were impossible to ignore. The prosecution argued that Marcus had motive, means, and opportunity, even without physical presence. They showed financial records, shipping receipts, and timelines that placed the delivery at Daniel's door hours before his death. They demonstrated how Marcus accessed Daniel's accounts after his death, deleting messages and wiping the phone remotely. The defense responded by attacking the idea of intent. They argued that online arguments were common and rarely led to violence. They claimed Marcus had sent the package as a warning, not knowing it could kill. They suggested Daniel, with his curiosity and knowledge, might have mishandled the substance or even poisoned himself accidentally. But that argument unraveled under expert testimony. Chemists explained that the toxin was not something an ordinary person would encounter. It was not sold casually. It required careful handling and precise knowledge. The delivery method used in the package showed planning, not recklessness. When Daniel's sister took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She described her brother as cautious and private, someone who believed deeply in fairness. She spoke about his love for puzzles, his obsession with uncovering hidden truths, and his belief that knowledge could protect him. Her voice broke when she described receiving the call that he was gone. She told the jury that Daniel trusted systems, rules, and logic. He believed that if he followed them, he would be safe. That belief had cost him his life. Marcus chose to testify in his own defense. It was a risky move, but his lawyers believed it was necessary. On the stand, he appeared composed, almost polite. He admitted to the online arguments and to sending the package. He insisted, again and again, that he never intended to kill Daniel. He described feeling harassed, threatened, and exposed. He said Daniel had destroyed his sense of safety by making accusations that could ruin his life. He framed his actions as desperation, not malice. But under cross-examination, cracks began to show. The prosecutor asked why he chose a toxin known for its lethality, why he used an anonymous shipping service, why he accessed Daniel's accounts after his death instead of contacting authorities. Marcus struggled to answer without contradicting himself. The most damaging moment came when the prosecutor asked a simple question. If the package was only meant to scare Daniel, why was there no message explaining that? No warning. No note. No way for Daniel to protect himself. Marcus had no answer. After weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly, tension hanging in the air. Daniel's family waited quietly, holding on to hope. Marcus sat alone, staring at the table in front of him. The deliberations lasted 3 days. When the jury returned, their faces were serious. The verdict was read slowly and clearly. Guilty of first-degree murder. A quiet gasp filled the room. Daniel's sister closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Marcus showed little reaction. His expression remained calm, almost distant, as if he had already accepted the outcome. The judge sentenced Marcus to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, the judge spoke about the nature of the crime. He said that silence did not lessen the violence. Planning did not reduce responsibility. Killing someone without bloodshed was still murder. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to file their stories. Headlines focused on the uniqueness of the case, the science behind the poison, and the idea of a killer who never visited the crime scene. But for those closest to Daniel, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was gone, taken by someone who believed distance made them untouchable. Months later, Daniel's apartment was rented out again. The walls were repainted, the carpets replaced, the bed removed. To new residents, it was just another quiet place to live. They had no reason to suspect what had happened there. The case became part of police training programs, used to teach investigators about modern crimes and unconventional methods. It served as a warning that danger no longer needed to knock on the door. Sometimes, it arrived in the form of a delivery, a message, or an idea. Daniel Cross's story ended in silence, but its impact did not. His death reminded the world that violence can be invisible, that the absence of blood does not mean the absence of harm, and that justice, even when delayed, can still speak. In the end, the murder with no blood at the crime scene was solved not through force, but through patience, knowledge, and the refusal to ignore what felt wrong. And though the crime itself was quiet, the truth echoed far beyond the walls of a silent apartment.